When my cousin, General Michael Carter, was serving overseas, our power-hungry HOA president, Linda Harper, saw an opportunity to bulldoze his historic family home. She never expected him to return early with a U.S. senator on speed dial. What started as a simple property violation turned into a national scandal about veterans' rights, landing half the HOA board in federal court. Welcome to the story of how our quiet suburb became the center of a battle for justice. The beginning of the end. I'll never forget the morning I caught Linda Harper taking pictures of Michael's house. She didn't even try to hide it. There she stood, in her designer workout clothes, her perfectly manicured nails tapping away at her phone screen. The same hands that had voted to approve her husband's construction company contracts were now documenting what she called violations at Michael's home. "Excuse me, Linda, but what exactly are you doing?" I asked, walking up to her with my coffee still in hand. I'd been watching her circle Michael's colonial house like a vulture for the past 15 minutes from my kitchen window. "Oh, good morning," she said with a fake smile that could have cracked glass. "Just documenting some serious maintenance issues. The paint is clearly 2 shades off from the approved HOA color palette. And these hedges," she gestured dramatically at the perfectly trimmed bushes Michael's daughter and I maintained every weekend, "are at least half an inch above regulation height." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that Michael had taught me to always keep my cool. "Linda, Michael is literally serving our country right now. He's a general, and this house has been in our family for 4 generations. The paint was approved 3 years ago by the previous board. Rules change, dear," she said, typing something into her phone. "And deployment is no excuse for letting property values drop. Did you know the community center proposal could increase home values by 30%? That was the first time I'd heard about any community center." I watched her take more photos, my stomach turning as I remembered how the last 3 homeowners who'd fought with Linda had mysteriously ended up with liens on their properties. The hidden agenda. That afternoon, I spent hours going through every HOA document I could find. Hidden in the meeting minutes from last month, there it was, a proposal for a state-of-the-art community center, right in the middle of our block, right where Michael's house stood. The next week was a blur of certified letters arriving at Michael's house, each one citing more ridiculous violations. The brass knocker that had survived 2 world wars was suddenly not in compliance. The rose bushes his daughter planted before his deployment were deemed invasive species. I tried calling Michael, but military communications were restricted during his current operation. All I could do was send emails, unsure if he'd get them in time. Each day, more HOA board members drove by slowly, taking notes. I installed security cameras after I caught Linda's husband, Greg, measuring the property line at midnight with a flashlight. The final straw came when I spotted Linda leading a group of suited investors on a tour of our street. "This entire area will be transformed," I overheard her say. "The outdated structures will be removed, starting with that eyesore." She pointed directly at Michael's house. That night, I called Michael's daughter, Emily, at college. "Something's wrong," I told her. "I think they're planning something big, and your dad's deployment makes his house an easy target." "But Dad's supposed to be home in 2 weeks, Emily said, her voice shaking. "They can't just take our house, right? All our family photos are there. Mom's garden. Everything." I wanted to tell her it would be fine, but Linda had already survived 3 lawsuits from other homeowners. She knew exactly how to work the system. As I hung up the phone, a certified letter arrived. The HOA was calling an emergency meeting the next night to vote on the community center proposal. My heart stopped when I read the fine print. They'd scheduled it exactly 13 days before Michael's return date, 1 day short of the 2-week notice required for deployed service members under federal law. Linda had done her homework, and I realized, with growing horror, that this wasn't just about property values or community centers. This was personal, and she'd been planning it for months. The bulldozers arrived. I woke up to the sound of heavy machines rumbling down our street at 6:30 a.m. Through my bedroom window, I saw 3 yellow bulldozers and a large dump truck headed straight for Michael's house. My heart started racing as I threw on my shoes and grabbed the folder of legal documents I'd been keeping close since Linda started making threats. The morning fog hadn't even lifted when I ran outside, still in my pajamas. Linda was already there, in her designer workout clothes, tapping away on her iPad with that fake smile she always wore. Two police cars were parked nearby. She'd planned this. "Stop," I yelled, running up with Michael's deployment papers in my hand. "This house belongs to an active service member. You can't do this." My hands were shaking as I held up the power of attorney documents Michael had given me. Linda just laughed and kept tapping on her iPad. "Oh, sweetie," she said, not even looking up. "The board had an emergency meeting last night. We voted unanimously to proceed with immediate demolition due to severe structural issues." She finally looked at me, her eyes cold. "It's all perfectly legal. We even have a city inspector's report." I felt sick to my stomach. "What inspector?" "I've been here every day." The demolition crew chief walked over, looking uncomfortable. I shoved Michael's property tax receipts at him. "Look, everything's paid up. They can't do this." Linda stepped between us. "Actually, we haven't received any tax payments for 6 months. Such a shame." She pulled out a thick folder. "We sent multiple notices. I guess they got lost in the mail to wherever your cousin is stationed." My hands were trembling as I pulled up my phone's banking app. There they were, 6 canceled checks to the HOA, all cleared by their bank. "You cashed these checks." "I have proof right here." Linda waved her hand dismissively. "Those were applied to other outstanding violations. See these reports? Overgrown grass, unauthorized paint color, non-compliant mailbox height." She kept listing ridiculous violations while the bulldozer engines grew louder. I called Michael's lawyer, pacing back and forth on the sidewalk. "Pick up, pick up, pick up." The call went to voicemail. The police officers stood by, watching, saying they couldn't interfere with a civil matter. I felt helpless as the demolition crew started setting up their equipment. Neighbors began coming outside, drawn by the noise. Most stayed back, but old Mrs. Thompson from next door shuffled over with her phone held high, recording everything. "I remember when Michael's grandparents built this house," she said loudly. "Right after he came back from Korea. The whole neighborhood helped." Linda shot her an angry look. The bulldozer claw raised up, and I couldn't hold back my tears. "The general returns." That's when my phone rang. The screen showed Michael's smiling face in his uniform. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. "Hey, cousin." His voice was cheerful. "You'll never believe this, but I managed to catch an early flight. Just landed at the airport. Thought I'd surprise everyone." I stared at the bulldozer inching toward his front porch, where we used to drink lemonade in the summer, the porch swing where his daughter learned to read, the window of the room where his wife spent her last days. "Michael," my voice cracked. "You need to get here right now." "Linda." They're about to." The crunch of wood splitting cut me off as the bulldozer claw took its first bite out of our family's history. Behind me, Linda was already on her phone too. "Yes, honey, they're starting now. Make sure your crew is ready to break ground for the community center next week. The permits? Don't worry about those. I've got it all handled." The roar of the bulldozer drowned out everything else as I watched my cousin's life being torn apart, praying he would make it in time. The turning point. What I didn't know then was that Linda's perfect plan was about to blow up in her face in ways none of us could have imagined. I'll never forget how the morning sun caught the general stars as Michael stepped out of my car. The bulldozer operator's face went white as a sheet, his hand frozen on the controls that were midway through destroying our grandparents' bay window. That beautiful stained glass our grandmother had picked out in 1962 lay shattered across the front lawn like broken dreams. Linda was in the middle of a speech about community progress to a small crowd of neighbors when she spotted Michael. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to deflate as he walked past her without even a glance. The only sound was his polished dress shoes crunching over broken glass and splintered wood. I watched my cousin, who had faced down warlords and terrorists, bend down to pick up his daughter Emily's first ballet trophy from the wreckage. The gold plastic dancer was snapped in half. He tucked it gently into his uniform pocket, his face calm, but his eyes burning with the kind of quiet fury I'd only seen once before, when he got the news about his wife's cancer. "Ma'am," he addressed Linda with such military courtesy it made her flinch. "I believe you're standing on my property." He pulled out a weathered document from his briefcase. "This land deed dates back to 1947, when my grandfather returned from World War II. I'm curious, when exactly did the HOA acquire the right to demolish it?" Linda tried to recover, waving her HOA papers like a shield. "The board's decision was unanimous, General. Your cousin was informed." We have all the proper documentation. Michael held up his hand, and Linda stopped mid-sentence like a schoolgirl caught passing notes. He pulled out his phone, pressed a single number on speed dial, and waited. The crowd of neighbors leaned in, not wanting to miss a word. Bill? Yes, it's Michael. Remember the talk we had about local government overreach? He paused, looking straight at Linda. Well, you won't believe what I'm looking at right now. Yes, that property. The one my grandfather willed to me. The one protected under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Linda's face changed from red to pale as Michael mentioned the federal law protecting deployed service members' property rights. But it was his next words that made her grab her designer purse like a life preserver. Yes, Senator Williams, I think your committee would be very interested in how the HOA handled this situation. He listened for a moment. And bring the press. That's very thoughtful of you, Bill. See you in an hour. The aftermath. The demolition crew was already backing away, making excuses about lunch breaks and wrong addresses. Linda's husband, Greg, who I'd seen bragging at the mailbox about his construction company's guaranteed contract for the new community center, was suddenly very interested in his shoes. Michael walked the perimeter of his ruined home, taking photos with his phone. He paused at his daughter's bedroom, or what was left of it. The walls were still standing, but the roof was gone. Emily's space posters fluttered in the breeze like surrender flags. The sight of her NASA bedsheets mixed with broken roof tiles made my throat tight. Sir, a young woman stepped forward from the crowd. I recognized her as Sarah from 3 doors down, always too scared to speak at HOA meetings. I have videos of everything. They started at dawn, ignored your cousin's legal papers, and, she glanced nervously at Linda, I heard Mrs. Harper on the phone last night, talking about how the demolition had to be done before you got back. More neighbors stepped forward, offering cell phone videos, copies of emails, meeting minutes. It was like a dam of fear had broken. Everyone had a story about Linda's threats and the HOA's bullying, but no one had dared to speak up until now. Michael thanked each person, taking their contact information with the same attention to detail he'd used planning military operations. I could almost see the strategy forming behind his eyes. He hadn't just come home to a destroyed house. He'd walked into a war zone of small-town politics and corruption. The fall of Linda Harper. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. Linda's phone buzzed with a news alert. Her face went from pale to gray as she read it. Decorated general's home demolished while deployed, HOA under federal investigation. Michael straightened his uniform and turned to address the growing crowd of neighbors, many now holding up phones to record. My grandfather built this house with his own hands after fighting for our country. He taught me that some things are worth fighting for, even if the battlefield is in your own backyard. He smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. I do believe the real estate lawyers are about to arrive, Linda. I hope you kept good records. Through the crowd of murmuring neighbors, I spotted Linda's Mercedes peeling out of her driveway, her designer purse forgotten on our demolished front steps. But Michael wasn't done yet. He had that look in his eye, the same one he'd had before leading his most successful missions. Now, he said quietly, pulling out another document, let's talk about the interesting pattern of contracts awarded to board members' companies over the past 5 years. The legacy. I never expected to see 6 news vans fighting for parking spots on our quiet street. But that's what happens when you mess with the wrong general. The morning started with Senator Williams marching up our driveway like he was heading into battle himself. He took one look at the rubble of Michael's home and pulled out his phone. Get me the state attorney general, he barked. Now. Linda came running out of her house in her designer bathrobe, her face pale as chalk. Gone was her usual smirk. This is a private HOA matter, she squeaked, but nobody was listening. 2 police cars pulled up, and I watched her stumble backward when the officers started taking photos of the destruction. I couldn't help but smile when Michael pulled out the folder I'd been keeping safe. Inside were copies of every check he'd sent to the HOA, along with certified mail receipts proving Linda had received them. Funny how all these payments went missing, he said, his voice steady and calm. The detective writing in his notebook didn't seem to find it funny at all. That's when the real bombshell dropped. A young intern from the senator's office, who'd been digging through public records all morning, came running up with a stack of papers. Sir, you need to see this, she called out. The documents showed that Linda's husband's construction company had won the bid for the community center 3 months ago, before the HOA had even voted on the project. The reporters were having a field day. One of them discovered that Linda had sent violation notices to 3 other deployed service members' homes in the past year. Another found out she'd tried to force an elderly couple out last summer, claiming their garden gnomes were destroying property values. Michael stood in the middle of it all, still in his uniform, helping the forensics team salvage what they could from his crushed home. He didn't rage or yell like Linda, who was now screaming at her husband on her phone in her driveway. Instead, he carefully placed each recovered photo in evidence bags, telling the story behind each one to the growing crowd of neighbors who'd come to support him. The final blow. That's when Linda made her biggest mistake. She marched over, waving a thick HOA rule book. Page 394 clearly states that the board has emergency powers to remove hazardous structures, she shouted. The crowd went silent. Michael turned to her slowly, and in that moment, I saw why he'd risen to the rank of general. Linda, he said quietly, my great-grandfather built this house after returning from World War II. He used his own 2 hands to lay these bricks you just crushed. Tell me, what was the emergency? She opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water. The cameras were rolling. Everyone waited. Then Bill, who'd been our mailman for 20 years, stepped forward. I have something you all need to see, he said, pulling out his phone. He'd taken a video yesterday of Linda and her husband walking around Michael's property, measuring and marking spots. They were talking about where the gym would go, Bill said. This was before any vote happened. The state attorney general himself arrived just as Linda's husband pulled up in his Mercedes. He took one look at the scene and tried to drive away, but a police car was already blocking his exit. Inside his briefcase, they found the real smoking gun, blueprints for the community center, dated 2 months before Michael's house was even marked for demolition. The aftermath. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers, reporters, and building inspectors. 7 HOA board members faced criminal charges. Linda and her husband were looking at serious prison time for fraud and violating the Service Members Civil Relief Act. They'd messed with the wrong family. But the real victory wasn't watching Linda being led away in handcuffs or seeing her house go up for sale when they couldn't afford their fancy lawyers. It was watching our community come together to make things right. Veterans from 3 states showed up with tools and supplies. Local businesses donated materials. Even the mayor came by to help lay the foundation for Michael's new home, the colonial style Linda hated so much. The Historical Society fast-tracked its protection, along with 6 other veteran-owned properties in our neighborhood. Today, I'm sitting on Michael's new front porch, watching his daughter Emily practice ballet in the yard. The house looks almost exactly like the old one, but better, built with love by people who understand what service and sacrifice really mean. There's a new wall in the kitchen where Emily's height marks are growing, right next to the shadow box holding pieces of the old house we managed to save. Linda's community center never happened. Instead, that land became a memorial park honoring local veterans. Sometimes, when I walk by, I see families having picnics where Linda wanted to put her luxury condos. Emily loves the playground equipment donated by the same construction companies that turned down Linda's sketchy contracts. Michael never brags about how he brought down a corrupt HOA board. He just smiles when new neighbors ask about the small piece of his old front door hanging beside his medals. It's a reminder, he tells them, that home is worth fighting for. The legacy lives on. The FBI investigation is still ongoing, and they found similar schemes in other neighborhoods. But here's the thing that really gets me. Last week, I saw Linda's son helping at the Veterans Food Bank downtown. He looked me in the eye and said, I'm sorry for what my parents did. Maybe that's the best victory of all, knowing that sometimes justice comes with a chance for healing. The Homeowners Defense Alliance. I never expected our story to change so many lives, but that's exactly what happened. After a video of Linda's arrest went viral, my phone started ringing nonstop with calls from military families across the country sharing similar HOA horror stories. Michael looked at me over his morning coffee and said, we need to help them all. The news crews might have packed up and left our street, but we were just getting started. With Michael's military connections and my experience documenting Linda's schemes, we created the Homeowners Defense Alliance. Every week, more veterans joined our cause, sharing their own battles with unfair HOA boards who tried to bully them while they served overseas. Linda's replacement on the HOA board, a retired Marine named Mike, discovered something interesting in the old files. Our neighborhood wasn't the only target. Linda's husband's construction company had been eyeing properties in 3 other military communities. Each time, the same pattern: suddenly strict enforcement of minor violations, lost paperwork, and quick demolition votes while homeowners were deployed. I watched Michael transform our dining room into a command center, with maps showing HOA trouble spots across the state pinned to every wall. The senator who helped us started drafting new laws to protect military families from predatory HOA practices. They named it the Harper Act. Oh yes, we made sure Linda's name would be forever linked to the solution, not just the problem. The final twist. The real surprise came when Linda's teenage daughter visited us one afternoon. She was crying, clutching a box of old photos she'd saved from our dumpster before the demolition. "Mom never told me these were in there," she whispered, handing Michael a dusty album of his daughter's baby pictures we thought were lost forever. Sometimes, good things come from unexpected places. Last week, we celebrated the first victory of our Homeowners Defense Alliance. A young Army nurse in Texas called us after her HO tried to fine her $100 per day for a flagpole her late father installed before she deployed. Michael made some calls. I drafted some letters. And suddenly, that HOA board wasn't so brave anymore. The flag still flies, and now there's a precedent for others to follow. Remember that community center Linda wanted so badly? The land sits empty now, but not for long. Michael donated it to create affordable housing for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. The first families move in next month, and guess who volunteered to help them settle in? Linda's daughter. She says she wants to make things right. People ask me if I'm still angry about what happened. Honestly, I'm grateful. Without Linda's greed, we might never have discovered how many other military families needed help. We might never have built this amazing community of supporters who look out for each other while our heroes serve overseas. And Michael's daughter might never have learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, losing your home helps you build something even better. Speaking of Michael, he just walked in with another stack of case files and that determined look in his eyes. There's a retired Navy SEAL in Florida whose HOA is trying to ban his service dog. And well, let's just say Linda taught us exactly what to do about bullies who mess with the wrong veterans. Want to guess how this one ends?